I don't like camping alone. Never have. But sometimes things happen and you don't have much of a choice. It was supposed to be a group trip, me, my brother, and a couple of friends. We planned everything for weeks, picked a remote spot near a lake, packed up all the gear, and looked forward to 3 days away from everything. Just peace and quiet. Then, one by one, they dropped out. My brother had car trouble. One friend caught the flu. Another had some last-minute work thing come up. I should have canceled too, but I'd already taken time off work, and I didn't want to waste the effort I'd put into planning. So, I told myself it wouldn't be that bad. I'd be alone, but it wasn't my first time camping, and I knew the area well enough. It wasn't like I'd be that deep in the woods anyway. Just a few miles from the main road, not too far from a small town. I could handle it. I got to the site in the early evening. It was a good spot. A clearing surrounded by thick pines, close enough to the lake that I could hear the water but far enough that the bugs wouldn't be too bad. The air was cool, the sky clear. It was shaping up to be a nice trip. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and cooked some food. Everything was fine. Quiet but fine. The first night I slept hard. No noises, no weird feelings. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional ripple from the lake. I woke up early, made coffee, and spent most of the day hiking. Found a trail that led up a small ridge where I could see the lake stretching out below me. It was beautiful, peaceful. I took my time getting back, enjoying the solitude. It was that second night when things got strange. I was sitting by the fire, just staring into the flames, listening to the woods. The sound of the wind had picked up a bit, making the trees sway. The fire crackled, sending little sparks up into the dark. I wasn't scared, but I had this feeling, like I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything obvious. No snapping branches, no shadows moving between the trees. Just a feeling, a weight in my chest that I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to camping alone, that my brain was making something out of nothing. But I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, checking the edges of the clearing, scanning the darkness between the trees. I let the fire die down and went to bed, telling myself I was being stupid. I zipped up my tent, laid down, and listened to the night sounds. Owls, distant rustling, the wind through the branches. Normal stuff. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not an animal. I know what deer and raccoons sound like when they move through the woods. This was different, slow, deliberate, like someone trying to be quiet but not quiet enough. It wasn't close, not right outside the tent or anything, but it was there, moving just past the tree line. I held my breath, listening. It stopped. The woods went dead silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I didn't move, just stayed as still as possible, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, my heart hammering. I waited. 5 minutes, 10, nothing, just silence. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe a branch falling, or the wind shifting the leaves in a way that sounded like footsteps. I forced myself to relax. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up to something scraping against my tent. It was soft, just a light drag against the fabric. My whole body locked up. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then it stopped. No more scraping, just my own breath in the dark. I waited, barely breathing, listening for anything else. Then, footsteps again, this time closer. I sat up fast, reaching for my flashlight. I clicked it on, shining it through the thin walls of my tent. Nothing, just the pale glow of the fabric. I swallowed hard and unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. My fire pit was still smoldering, giving off a dull orange glow. The trees swayed in the breeze. Nothing looked out of place. But I wasn't alone. I knew it. I could feel it. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, just listening. The footsteps didn't come back. No more scraping. Finally, I convinced myself to lay back down, but I didn't sleep. Not really. Every little noise had me on edge. I just waited for the sun to come up. When it did, I got out of the tent immediately, scanning the area. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone had been near my tent. I almost felt stupid. Almost. Then I saw it. Just past the tree line, maybe 20 feet from my tent, was a long, thin groove in the dirt, like something had been dragged. It led off into the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. My stomach turned. I had no idea what had made it, and I wasn't about to find out. I packed up as fast as I could, threw everything into my backpack without bothering to organize it. My hands were shaking. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there, watching me, but there was nothing. I hiked back to my car without stopping, barely breathing the whole way. When I finally got inside, I locked the doors and just sat there, gripping the wheel. My whole body felt electric, like I'd just run for miles. I didn't really start to calm down until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I don't know what happened out there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. But I don't think so, and I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in the wild, away from the noise and the rush of everyday life, that made me feel alive. The crisp air, the smell of pine, the distant hoot of an owl. It was all perfect. I had gone on dozens of solo camping trips before, so when I decided to head out to a remote site deep in the forest for a weekend alone, I didn't think twice about it. The place I had chosen wasn't well known. It was about a 4-hour drive from home, and the last stretch of it was down an old logging road that barely looked like it was still in use. I had read about the spot in an old forum post, a hidden gem, the kind of place only experienced campers could get to. I packed everything I needed: a tent, food, water, a fire starter, my knife, a small axe, and a first aid kit. My GPS worked only intermittently that deep in the woods, so I had printed out a map and made sure I had a compass just in case. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already starting to dip. I parked my truck in a small clearing, locked it up, and started my hike into the woods. The path wasn't marked, but I followed the directions carefully, counting my steps and watching for the landmarks mentioned in the forum post. A fallen log shaped like an arch, a boulder split in two, a stream running eastward. It took me nearly an hour, but I found the site, a flat clearing surrounded by tall trees, a perfect spot for a quiet night in nature. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent and gathering wood for a fire. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant trickle of the stream. I made a small fire and cooked dinner, just some canned beans and a protein bar. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. As the fire crackled, I leaned back against a log, looking up at the darkening sky. Then I heard it, a sharp snap of a twig somewhere in the trees behind me. I froze, my hand tightening around my knife. I knew the sounds of the forest well. This wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. The firelight didn't reach far, but I could make out the dark shapes of trunks and branches swaying slightly in the breeze. Nothing else. I waited, barely breathing, listening. The sound didn't come again. After a few minutes, I let out a slow breath. Maybe it had been an animal after all. A deer stepping wrong. It wasn't uncommon. Still, I kept my knife close as I banked the fire for the night and crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside felt amplified in the silence. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind shifting through the trees. I told myself it was nothing. I was alone out here. No one knew about this spot except for a few people online, and I had seen no sign of anyone else on my way in. But I still couldn't shake the unease. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in complete darkness. The fire had gone out. The woods were silent, too silent. I listened, heart pounding. The usual night sounds were gone. No insects, no distant calls of animals. Just silence. And then, a slow, steady sound. Footsteps. Not close, but not far either. Moving through the trees, circling the campsite. I stayed completely still, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. My mind raced. What do I do? Call out? Stay quiet? If it was an animal, making noise might scare it off. If it wasn't, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Then, suddenly, a low rustling sound, right next to the tent. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. Something or someone was right outside. I could hear the faintest shuffle of movement, slow and deliberate, like they were waiting to see if I was awake. I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my flashlight. I flicked it on and aimed it at the tent wall. Nothing. No shadow. No movement. I unzipped the tent in one quick motion and shined the light outside. Nothing. But the ground was disturbed. The dirt flattened in places like someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the knife in my hand, my back pressed against the tent wall. I waited for the first light of dawn, and as soon as it came, I packed up my things as fast as I could. On the hike back, I kept checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched never went away. The forest felt different now, less peaceful, like I had overstayed my welcome. When I reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I tossed my gear in the back and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I turned the key in the ignition, I caught something in the side mirror. A figure, just barely visible between the trees. Watching, I didn't wait. I threw the truck into gear and tore out of there, not looking back until I was miles down the road. I never found out who or what was out there that night. I never went back to that spot. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I still get that feeling, like someone is watching from just beyond the trees, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I never do. I always loved being outdoors. There was something about the quiet of the woods that made me feel at peace, like I could step away from everything for a little while and just exist. That's why I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I'd done it before plenty of times, but this one was different. I had taken a week off work and wanted to make the most of it. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, about an hour from any major roads, where I wouldn't have to deal with the sounds of people or passing cars. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sun still high and bright. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick around me. I parked my truck at the trailhead and shouldered my pack. I had about a 2-mile hike ahead of me, nothing too bad. The trail was well-worn but empty. I hadn't seen another vehicle when I pulled up, which meant I had the place to myself. That's exactly what I wanted. The hike in was peaceful. Birds chirped, squirrels rustled through the underbrush, and the wind moved through the trees like a gentle whisper. I found my spot near a small clearing by a slow-moving stream. It was perfect. I set my pack down and got to work setting up camp. First the tent, then the fire pit. I gathered wood from around the site, making sure to grab plenty before nightfall. As the sun started to sink, I got a small fire going and made myself some dinner. Dehydrated meals weren't anything special, but they did the job. I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the woods. A few crickets had started chirping, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed in the distance. It was peaceful. Then I heard something else, a sharp snap like a branch breaking underfoot. It was close, maybe 20 yards away in the trees. I froze, listening. Probably just a deer, I told myself. I had seen plenty of them on the way in. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees and darkness beyond the glow of my fire. I let it go and went back to my meal. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not a deer, something heavier. I stood up, my heart picking up speed. "Hello," I called out, feeling stupid as soon as the word left my mouth. No one should be out here. I was miles from anyone. Silence. I grabbed my hatchet and flashlight, stepping a few feet from the fire. The light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and bushes. The sounds had stopped. I stood there for a minute listening, waiting. Nothing. After a while, I went back to my seat, but I didn't feel as relaxed as before. The fire burned lower, and I decided to call it a night. I doused the flames, leaving only a few glowing embers, and crawled into my tent. I zipped myself in and lay back on my sleeping bag, listening to the quiet. Then I heard it again, closer, a footstep, not an animal, person. My blood ran cold. I reached for my hatchet, gripping it tight. My flashlight was beside me, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I strained my ears, holding my breath. Another step, then another, right outside my tent. I swallowed, my mouth dry. My mind raced. Who was out here? A lost hiker? No, they would have called out. This was different. This person was moving slowly, deliberately. A shadow passed over the thin fabric of my tent. Someone was standing there. I wanted to scream, to bolt out of there, but I forced myself to stay still. I gripped my hatchet so tightly my knuckles ached. The seconds stretched on. Then, a long, slow drag of fabric. Someone was running their hand along the side of my tent. Couldn't breathe. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stayed frozen, waiting, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, but there was nothing but the sound of the forest now. I stayed like that for hours, barely daring to breathe. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was early morning, the sun casting a pale light through the trees. For a moment, I thought maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. But when I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, my blood turned to ice. There, in the dirt around my campsite, were footprints. Human footprints. They circled my tent. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. This wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been out here watching me, walking around my tent while I lay inside, helpless. I didn't waste time packing. I threw my gear into my pack, barely taking the time to fold my tent. My hands shook as I worked. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like eyes were still on me. The hike back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig made my pulse jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My breathing was ragged, my hands still trembling as I started the engine. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I never went back to that spot. Hell, I haven't gone camping alone since. Whoever was out there that night, whoever stood outside my tent, listening, waiting, they never made a move. But that was the worst part. They could have, and I wouldn't have been able to stop them. I don't know why I ever agreed to this trip. I told myself it would be a good way to clear my head, to get away from the constant noise of my life for a few days. But now, sitting in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a dying fire and the endless black of the woods pressing in on me, I regret every single decision that led me here. Started as a simple plan, just me, my backpack, and a weekend in the wilderness. I picked a spot deep in the state forest, well away from any of the established campsites. I wanted isolation, no other people, just me and nature. It took me nearly 4 hours to hike in from where I parked, and by the time I found a decent clearing to set up camp, the sun was already sinking low behind the trees. I built my fire, set up my tent, and made myself a quick meal. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, listening to the occasional rustling in the underbrush, but that was normal. Animals move at night, and I knew enough not to let every little noise spook me. I turned in early, lying in my tent, letting the quiet settle around me. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was cold against my face. Then I heard it, a soft, distant snapping of branches. Not close, but not far either. I listened for a while, trying to decide if it was just a deer moving through the trees. It stopped after a few minutes, and I eventually fell back asleep. The second day was quiet. I spent the morning exploring the area, making sure I had my bearings. I marked a few trees with my knife so I wouldn't get lost, something I always did when hiking in deep woods. Around noon, I heard something, a faint, distant sound. It almost sounded like voices, not words, just the rise and fall of something human, too far away to make out clearly. I stood still, listening, but the sound faded, probably just the wind playing tricks on me. That night, the unease set in. I built my fire up higher than the night before, trying to push back the darkness. I cooked my food, but I wasn't really hungry. Something felt wrong. The woods felt different. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something just outside the fire's reach. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I crawled into my tent early, zipped it up tight. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise had me tensing up, straining my ears. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it again, branches snapping. Closer this time, deliberate, not the random movement of an animal. Something was moving through the trees near my camp. I held my breath, listening. It was slow, careful. I reached for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. My mind was racing. A bear? No, bears don't move like that. Person? That was worse. Much worse. Then the noise stopped. The silence stretched on, my ears straining for any hint of movement. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, but eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, and I stepped out of my tent, stiff and groggy. The fire was nothing but ash. Everything in my camp was where I left it, untouched. No tracks, no signs of anything. Maybe I had imagined it. But as I packed up my gear, I found something that sent a chill through me. Near the edge of my campsite, where the trees thickened into darkness, a single boot print. Not mine. Someone had been here. I didn't waste time packing. My hands shook as I rolled up my sleeping bag, stuffed everything into my backpack. I had planned to stay another night, but there was no way in hell I was doing that now. I needed to get out. I started hiking back the way I came, moving fast. Too fast. I nearly twisted my ankle on a root, forced myself to slow down. The woods felt different now, like they were watching me. Every crunch of leaves under my boots felt too loud, like I was alerting something to my presence. Then, maybe an hour into my hike, I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I stopped. So did they. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just endless trunks and shadows. My heart pounded in my chest. I took another step. So did whatever was following me. Panic clawed at my throat. I didn't run. Running in the woods was a good way to get hurt. But I moved faster, pushing myself hard. The footsteps kept pace. Not hurrying, not falling behind. Just keeping the same steady distance. Then, ahead of me, something caught my eye. A scrap of fabric on a branch. Blue, faded. Piece of a shirt. And beneath it, something worse. A backpack, torn open, weathered by time and exposure. It had been there for months, maybe years. I had to get out. Now, I turned, breaking into a full run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps behind me sped up too. They weren't distant now. They were close, too close. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs threatened to give out. Then suddenly the trees thinned, and I saw it. My car, right where I left it. I dug into my pocket for my keys, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get them out. I yanked open the door, threw myself inside, and slammed the lock down just as something broke through the trees behind me. I didn't look. I didn't breathe. I just started the engine and tore out of there, gravel spitting from my tires. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway, until the forest was nothing but a distant blur in my rearview mirror. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I don't think I ever will. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never go camping alone again. I always liked camping alone. It was the quiet, I think. No voices, no traffic, no buzzing electronics. Just the wind moving through the trees and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. Felt like I could reset out there, away from the rush of the world. But this trip was different. felt different before I even set foot in the woods. I had chosen a spot deep in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from my house. It wasn't an official campground, just a place I had marked on a map after hours of scouring satellite images. I wanted solitude, and this place promised it. No trails leading in, no signs of past campers, just raw, untouched wilderness. The hike in was uneventful at first. I had to park my truck at the base of a narrow dirt road that wasn't drivable and walk the rest of the way in. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the dense trees, but I still had plenty of daylight left. I moved steadily uphill, stopping only to check my GPS to make sure I was heading the right way. My pack was heavy with supplies, but I liked the weight. It reminded me that I was prepared. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the spot. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with a flat area to pitch my tent and a fallen log nearby that I could use as a seat. I set down my pack and took a deep breath. The air smelled clean, fresh, like damp earth and pine needles. I had no cell signal out here, which was expected, but I made a mental note of the direction I had come from in case I needed to find my way back without GPS. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp. First, I pitched my tent, an easy task since I had done it 100 times before. Then, I gathered some firewood from around the area, stacking it neatly near the fire pit I had made with a few rocks. I liked doing things right. Everything had to be in place before dark. As the sun started dipping below the trees, I got the fire going. The flames crackled to life, sending up a warm, orange glow that pushed back the creeping darkness. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and ate while listening to the forest settle in for the night. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of the woods, the occasional rustling in the bushes, a distant owl calling through the trees. But as the night stretched on, the noises became off. The rustling wasn't just the wind, and it wasn't some small animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was heavier, slower, deliberate. I sat completely still, listening. My fire crackled, masking some of the softer sounds, but I was certain now, something was moving out there. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees, scanning the darkness beyond my campsite. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear. I had food with me after all, but I had taken all the right precautions. Sealed containers, no food left out. I wasn't worried. Not yet. I decided to ignore it. I doused the fire enough to let the embers smolder and crawled into my tent. My sleeping bag was warm, and I was tired from the hike. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise made me open my eyes, listening, waiting. The sounds outside continued, soft footsteps, twigs snapping. Something was out there. I reached for the small knife I always kept in my sleeping bag and gripped it tightly. I wanted to tell myself it was just paranoia, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but my gut told me otherwise. Eventually, exhaustion won. My grip loosened, my breathing slowed, and at some point, I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, the fire completely out. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I didn't know why. Then I heard it, right outside my tent. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. I froze. I didn't move, didn't even dare to shift in my sleeping bag. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. It was close, too close, just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating me from the outside world. I didn't know what to do. If it was an animal, maybe it would leave on its own. If it was something else, something human, I clenched my knife tighter. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the breathing stopped. Silence. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely breathing myself. My muscles ached from staying so still, but I didn't dare move. Eventually, dawn came. The first light seeped through the tent walls, painting them in soft shades of gray. I waited a little longer, listening. The forest was waking up, the normal sounds returning. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. Whatever had been there was gone. I slowly unzipped my tent and peered out. The campsite looked the same. My gear was untouched, my firewood still stacked neatly. But the ground was different. The dirt outside my tent was disturbed, the pine needles pushed aside. Footprints, not animal tracks. Footprints, bare, human. They circled my tent. My stomach dropped. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't even stop to eat. The entire time, I felt watched, like someone, was still out there, just beyond my sight. I kept my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, even though the sun was fully up now. The hike back was faster than the hike in. I didn't stop to rest, didn't look back. My truck was right where I left it, and I threw my pack in the back before locking the doors and peeling out of there. I never went back, never even looked at the map again. Maybe it was just some drifter, some hermit living deep in the woods. Or maybe it was something worse. I don't know. I don't want to know. All I know is that I wasn't alone out there, and someone was watching me sleep. I never liked camping much, but my brother convinced me to go. He always had a way of making things sound better than they actually were. Said it would be a break from the noise of the city, a chance to clear my head. I wasn't against the idea, really, but I wasn't exactly excited either. Still, I agreed. The plan was simple. Drive out to a remote spot in the woods, pitch a tent, fish in the nearby river, maybe hike a little, then head back in 2 days. The drive was long. The farther we got from town, the quieter everything became. No cars, no buildings, just long stretches of road cutting through thick forests. The sun was still high when we reached the dirt path leading to the campsite. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot my brother had heard about from a friend. Completely off the grid, he had said, like that was supposed to be a good thing. We parked the truck and got out. The air was cool and smelled like pine and damp earth. The trees stretched high above us, blocking out most of the sky. Felt like stepping into another world. We unloaded our gear and started setting up. The ground was uneven, covered in dry leaves and roots that made pitching the tent harder than it should have been. By the time we finished, the sun was getting lower, casting long shadows between the trees. We built a fire and cooked some food, mostly canned stuff and a few hot dogs. The fire crackled, and for a while it was nice, peaceful even. My brother talked about work, about a girl he was seeing, about how he was thinking of moving to a new city. I listened, nodded, but mostly just stared into the fire. Something about being out there made me feel uneasy, like we were being watched. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The woods at night always make people feel weird. We turned in early. The tent was small, barely enough room for the two of us. I lay on my back, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the distant sound of crickets and the occasional rustling in the bushes. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping outside. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, listening. Another snap, closer this time. I nudged my brother, whispering his name. He groaned, half asleep. I whispered again, and he finally turned over. "What?" he mumbled. "Something's outside." He sighed and sat up. We both listened. For a long moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, another snap, followed by the sound of leaves crunching. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Too heavy, too careful. My brother reached for the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to poke his head out. He scanned the area, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. "Nothing," he whispered, pulling back inside. "Probably a deer." I wasn't so sure, but I nodded anyway. We lay back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. Every little sound kept me on edge. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off again. Morning came, and everything seemed normal. The sun was up, the birds were chirping, and the uneasy feeling from the night before felt like a bad dream. My brother laughed about it over breakfast. "You were probably just hearing things," he said. I wanted to believe him, so I did. We spent the day fishing by the river, catching a few small ones, nothing impressive. It was a quiet day, but something still felt off. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, But when I looked, there was nothing. That night, the feeling got worse. We were sitting by the fire again when we heard it. A sound in the distance. It was faint at first, like something moving through the trees. Then it got louder, closer. Footsteps, slow, careful, coming from the direction of the truck. My brother grabbed the flashlight again, standing up. "Hello?" he called out. No answer, just the sound of footsteps stopping. We both stood there listening. Then another sound, a soft tapping, like fingers against wood. Our truck. Someone was tapping on our truck. I felt my stomach drop. My brother pointed the flashlight toward the truck, but the beam didn't reach far enough. He took a step forward, and I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. He hesitated, then nodded. We backed toward the tent, listening. The tapping stopped. The footsteps started again, moving away this time, fading into the trees. We waited, standing there for what felt like forever. Nothing, just silence. Eventually, my brother whispered, "Let's just go inside." We got into the tent, zipped it up, and sat there in the dark. I was wide awake, listening for any sound, any movement, but there was nothing. Morning came and we packed up fast. Neither of us talked about it. We just wanted to get out of there. We loaded up the truck and got in. My brother turned the key and the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me. We pulled onto the dirt path and started heading back toward the main road. Then I saw it, a single handprint on the back window of the truck. Smudged, too big to be either of ours. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. My brother saw it too. We drove the rest of the way in silence, not stopping until we were miles away. We never went camping again. I don't know why I'm writing this down. Maybe to clear my head. Maybe because I still haven't figured out what happened. And if I write it all out, it'll make sense. It's been a few months since that night, and I haven't been back out camping since. I don't think I ever will again. It started with a plan. Just me, a weekend in the woods, and some quiet. I needed the break. Life had been heavy, and nothing clears my head like getting away from everything. I picked a spot that wasn't too far, a stretch of deep forest land about 2 hours from home. It wasn't a campground, no numbered sites, no other people. Just a place I'd been a few times where I could set up and be alone. I packed light, just the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, my knife. Enough to get by, but not enough to weigh me down. I wasn't planning to be out there long. The drive was fine, just long stretches of road with nothing around but trees and the occasional house. I turned off the highway onto a dirt road that wound through the forest, bouncing a little on the uneven path. A few more miles in, I pulled off where I always did, parked my truck in the same spot, and grabbed my gear. The sun was still up, and I had a couple of hours to get to my usual clearing and set up before dark. The walk-in was peaceful. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. About half an hour in, I reached the clearing. It was the perfect spot. Flat, quiet, surrounded by trees but open enough for a fire. I dropped my pack and got to work setting up camp. Tent up, sleeping bag rolled out, firewood gathered. The routine was comforting. As the sun dipped lower, I got a small fire going. I wasn't hungry yet, so I just sat by the flames, letting my mind settle. The quiet out there wasn't the kind you get at home, where there's always a hum of something, traffic, voices, electronics. This was real silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or rustle in the trees. It was nice, until it wasn't. Started small. A noise just past the tree line. Could have been anything, an animal, the wind, but it was steady, like footsteps. Not close enough to be a concern, but not far enough to ignore either. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, something moving through the brush. But then it stopped. Just stopped. No retreating footsteps, no rustling, just silence. I sat still, listening. Nothing. The fire popped and I nearly jumped. I shook my head at myself, forced a chuckle. I was being stupid. Alone in the woods, the mind plays tricks. I ate a quick dinner, let the fire burn down, and crawled into my tent. It was warm enough that I didn't need to bundle up too much. I laid back, listened to the quiet, and waited for sleep. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer now, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight, my pulse thudding in my ears. The steps moved around my camp, circling. I couldn't see who it was. My fire had burned down to just embers, and my tent was zipped tight, but I knew they were there. I thought about calling out, but what would I say? Hello, like that would do anything. I wasn't about to give away that I was awake, that I knew. I waited. The steps moved again, slower this time. Then, after what felt like forever, they stopped, right outside my tent. I held my breath, my fingers locked around the knife handle. A shadow passed across the thin fabric. Someone was standing there, not moving, not speaking, just standing. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe a minute, maybe 10. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the steps moved away. First a few, then more, retreating into the trees until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting for them to come back. They never did. At some point, exhaustion won. My body shut down and I fell asleep. When I woke up, the sun was up and everything looked normal. But I knew better. I unzipped the tent slowly, scanning the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But I knew. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my bag without care. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just needed to get out. I kept my knife in my hand the whole walk back to the truck, my head on a swivel, listening. Nothing followed me. Nothing stopped me. When I reached my truck, I tossed my gear in the back and climbed in, locking the doors the second I was inside. My hands shook as I started the engine. I backed out, turned around, and got back on the road. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there that night. Maybe some hunter, maybe just some other camper who thought they were alone. Or maybe someone who had been watching, waiting. I don't know. I just know I won't be going back. I don't know why I agreed to this trip in the first place. Maybe it was the idea of getting away, shutting off from everything for a few days. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do something different, something that didn't involve the usual routine of work, sleep, repeat. The drive was long, the kind that wears on your patience more than your body. The roads twisted through endless trees, the sun dipping lower as I got closer to the campsite. I should have left earlier. By the time I arrived, the sky was already dark, the kind of dark that eats at your vision. No streetlights, no nearby cabins, just me and the thick woods pressing in on all sides. I parked the car in the small, dirt lot and took a deep breath before stepping out. The air was crisp, colder than I expected for late summer. I grabbed my gear from the trunk, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight. I had checked everything twice before leaving. I wasn't going to make any rookie mistakes. The campsite wasn't far from the parking lot, a 10-minute walk at most. I followed the narrow path through the trees, the beam of my flashlight bouncing with each step. The silence was heavy, unnatural. No wind, no crickets, just the sound of my boots crunching against dead leaves and twigs. I reached the clearing and set up camp. It took longer than expected, fumbling with the tent poles, trying to find level ground. Frustration crept in, but I kept pushing through. Once the tent was up, I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, placed my backpack at the entrance, and started a small fire. The flames crackled, sending flickers of light into the surrounding trees. I sat close to the fire, eating a granola bar, sipping from my water bottle. The night was too quiet. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting something to move, but there was nothing, just stillness. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks. The darkness does that. It makes you hear things that aren't there, see shapes that don't exist. But then there was a sound, a dull thud from the trees. It was distant, barely noticeable. I ignored it at first, chalked it up to an animal moving through the underbrush. Another thud, closer this time, heavier. I held my breath, listening. The fire crackled, but the sound was unmistakable. Something moving, slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only trunks and branches. I exhaled, shaking my head. I was just tired. That was all. I put out the fire, zipped myself inside the tent, and lay down. My heartbeat slowed, my breathing steadied. I needed to sleep. Then came another sound. Closer. Not a thud this time. A shuffle like something dragging across the ground. I froze, my body tensing. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just silence again. Minutes passed. My eyes grew heavy. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just paranoid. I drifted off. Then something touched the tent. A single, deliberate push against the fabric. I shot up, heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it at the tent walls. Silence. I held my breath, my ears strained for any sound. Then footsteps, slow, right outside. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly, like something was brushing against it. I swallowed hard. Could be an animal. A deer, maybe, or a bear. But bears don't move like that. And whatever this was, it wasn't sniffing, wasn't pawing at the tent like animals do. It was just standing there. I reached for the knife in my backpack, gripping it tightly. My mind raced. Do I call out? Do I stay silent? Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle in my body tensed. I listened, waited for the sound to return, but it never did. When the first light of dawn crept through the fabric of the tent, I unzipped it slowly and peered outside. The forest was still, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. And then I saw them. Footprints, human, barefoot, leading from the trees right up to my tent, and then back into the woods. I packed up faster than I ever have in my life. My hands shook as I tore down the tent, shoved everything into my backpack. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just moved. I didn't run, though I wanted to. I forced myself to walk, to keep my breathing steady. I followed the path back to my car, every step feeling like it took hours. When I finally reached the parking lot, I threw my gear into the back seat and locked the doors the second I got inside. My hands were gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I started the engine and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, back in civilization. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That someone, or something, had been out there with me, watching, waiting. I won't go camping alone again, ever. And I won't ever forget the feeling I had that night. The feeling that something out there, deep in those woods, had been watching me the whole time, waiting for me to fall asleep. I never wanted to go on this trip in the first place. It was my brother's idea. He had been talking about doing an overnight camping trip for months, saying how we never did anything together anymore, how we used to love being outside when we were kids, how we needed to get away from everything for a little while. I told him I wasn't interested. I wasn't the outdoorsy type anymore. But he kept pushing, and eventually I caved. We planned for a simple overnight trip. A drive out to a secluded campsite, just the two of us, some beer, some fishing, maybe a fire if we could get one going. No phones, no distractions, just a night away from everything. I figured it wouldn't kill me. The drive out was uneventful. We took his truck, bouncing over rough back roads, the kind of roads you wouldn't even know existed unless you were looking for them. He swore up and down that he knew about a perfect spot, one he had found with some friends a couple of years back. "You won't find it on any map," he told me. Like that was supposed to make me feel better. By the time we arrived, the sun was getting low. The place was nothing special, just a clearing by a small lake, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. There was no one else around. I could hear the water lapping gently at the shore, the distant sound of birds settling in for the night. It was peaceful, I had to admit, maybe even nice. We set up camp quickly. A cheap tent, a couple of folding chairs, a cooler filled with beer. My brother built a fire while I cracked open a drink and watched. The flames caught easily, and soon we had a good blaze going. We sat there, drinking, talking about nothing in particular. At some point, we decided to go check out the lake. My brother grabbed his flashlight, and we walked down to the shoreline. The water was still, dark, reflecting the last bits of daylight. We stood there for a while, listening to the quiet. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no bugs, no mosquitoes, no flies, not even the usual hum of crickets. Just silence. I mentioned it to my brother, but he just shrugged. Maybe it's too cold for them, he said. I didn't buy it, but I let it go. We headed back to the fire, but the feeling stuck with me. Something was off. I just didn't know what. We stayed up for a few more hours, drinking, talking, watching the fire burn down to embers. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. My brother crawled into the tent first, mumbling something about how he was going to sleep like a rock. I stayed up a little longer, staring into the dark woods, listening. Still no bugs. I turned in not long after. The tent was small, barely big enough for the both of us. I lay there for a long time, staring at the fabric above me, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard it, a sound outside, a rustling, not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate, slow. I held my breath. The sound moved closer. I felt my stomach tighten. I turned my head slowly, listening. My brother was out cold, snoring softly. I waited. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just my nerves. I let out a slow breath, trying to relax. Then the sound came again. Closer. Footsteps. My heart started pounding. I wanted to wake my brother, but I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped, right outside the tent. I could hear breathing. Slow. Shallow. Not an animal. Not a bear. Not a coyote. Person. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still. My mind was racing. Who the hell would be out here? We were miles from the nearest road. No other campers. No trails. No reason for anyone else to be here. I reached for my flashlight, moving as slowly as I could. My fingers wrapped around the handle and I flicked it on. The beam hit the fabric of the tent, lighting it up from the inside. A shadow, a shape, tall, motionless, right outside. I sucked in a sharp breath. My brother stirred beside me, mumbling in his sleep. The shadow shifted slightly, as if it had heard him. I didn't think. I just acted. I sat up fast, unzipping the tent in one rough motion. Flashlight aimed outside. Nothing. Just trees. Darkness. The fire had burned down completely. The truck was still there. The lake was still there, but no one else. I scanned the area, my heart hammering. My breath came in short gasps. The flashlight beam wobbled in my shaking hand. Nothing. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just drunk and paranoid. I zipped the tent back up and lay back down, but I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over. My body shut down and I drifted off. I woke up to the sun streaming through the tent fabric. My brother was already outside, stretching, yawning. I crawled out, blinking in the bright morning light. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the trees to our tent, and then away again, large, deep, human. My blood went cold. I looked at my brother. He was staring at them too, his face pale. We didn't say anything. We just packed up, fast. We didn't talk on the drive back. Neither of us ever mentioned it again. I always thought camping was a way to get away from everything, a way to escape the noise of everyday life and just enjoy the quiet. My wife and I had done it plenty of times before, setting up our tent in remote places, away from crowds and distractions. But this trip was different. It started with a simple plan. A weekend in the woods, just the two of us. We chose a spot deep in the national forest, a place I had read about online. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing off an old logging road, miles away from the nearest town. It seemed perfect, isolated, peaceful, and surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of nature. We packed our gear, double-checked our supplies, and made the drive out on a Friday afternoon. The road to the campsite was rough. We had to take it slow, dodging deep ruts and fallen branches. The farther we drove, the more the trees seemed to close in around us. The air felt heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. Eventually, we found the clearing just as described. A flat, grassy patch with enough space for the tent and a fire pit made from scattered stones. We set up camp quickly. The tent went up first, then the folding chairs and cooler. I gathered firewood while my wife laid out the sleeping bags. Everything was going smoothly, and for the first few hours it felt like any other camping trip. We sat by the fire, cooked dinner, and listened to the distant hoots of owls and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But as the night crept in, something felt off. It started with the silence. The usual nighttime sounds, chirping insects, the occasional crack of a branch, began to fade. It wasn't sudden, but it was noticeable. The forest just felt still, too still. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But then came the noises, not loud, not obvious, just subtle shifts in the darkness. The sound of something moving through the trees, stopping when I tried to focus on it. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon scavenging for food. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. My wife must have sensed it too because she suggested turning in early. We put out the fire, zipped up the tent, and crawled into our sleeping bags. The tent felt small, too exposed. Every creak outside made my skin crawl. I held my breath, listening, waiting for another sound. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. A noise had pulled me from sleep, but I wasn't sure what it was. I lay still, barely breathing, straining to hear, and then I caught it. A faint crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. Not an animal, something bigger, someone. My heart pounded. I didn't move, didn't even reach for the flashlight. I just listened. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. Whoever it was, they were standing there just feet away, silent. I could feel them, the weight of their presence pressing in through the thin nylon walls. Minutes passed, then more. The silence stretched so long that I started to think I imagined it. But then a whisper, not words, just the sound of breath. Slow, ragged, right outside. I reached out, gripping my wife's arm. She was awake. I could feel her shaking. We didn't speak. We just lay there, frozen. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound disappeared. The steps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. Neither did she. We waited for the first light, counting the minutes until the sky started to turn gray. The moment there was enough light to see, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my hands shaking. The clearing was empty. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I turned back to my wife. We're leaving. Now. We packed up in record time, shoving everything into the truck without bothering to organize it. Within minutes, we were on the road, heading back the way we came. The forest seemed different now, the trees pressing in closer, the road bumpier than before. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see something or someone watching us from the tree lean, but we never did. We made it home without saying much, just the occasional glance, the unspoken agreement that we wouldn't talk about it. Not yet, not until we had time to process whatever had happened. It's been months now, and I still don't have answers. I don't know who or what was out there that night. A stranger? A hunter who stumbled upon our camp? Someone living off the grid, watching from the shadows? I don't know. What I do know is that we haven't been camping since, and I don't think we ever will again. I don't know what made me pick that spot to camp. Maybe it was the silence, the kind of deep quiet you don't find just anywhere. It wasn't like the usual campgrounds with kids yelling and firewood cracking under someone's boots. This place was different, secluded, almost forgotten. It was the kind of place where you could step off the trail, and it would feel like no one had been there in years. I had driven nearly 4 hours from home, looking for a new place to set up for the weekend. I'd found the location online, some forum where experienced campers shared their favorite hidden spots. The post was old, years old, and no one had commented on it. Just a set of coordinates and a brief description. Quiet, isolated, perfect for solo camping. Beware of wildlife. That last part didn't bother me. I camped alone plenty of times. Bears, cougars, whatever. I knew how to deal with them, so I packed my gear and followed the directions. The road there was rough, nearly non-existent in places. My truck bounced over rocks and deep grooves in the dirt. The trees were thick, pressing in from both sides. After about an hour of slow, careful driving, I reached the dead end where I'd have to continue on foot. I loaded my pack, checked my knife, and grabbed my bear spray before heading in. The hike was brutal. The trail, if you could even call it that, was barely a game trail, just a narrow path through the underbrush. I followed it for nearly 2 miles before the land opened up to a clearing. And just like the post described, it was quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No rustling in the bushes. Just my breathing and the occasional snap of a branch under my boots. I set up camp near the treeline, close enough for cover but far enough that I had a good view of the clearing. The sky was dimming by the time I got my tent up and a fire started. I ate in silence, listening, waiting for the usual sounds of the woods to return. But they didn't. That night I barely slept. The silence wasn't normal. Anyone who's spent enough time in the wilderness knows that. Silence like that usually means something's wrong. Predators, maybe, or something worse. At some point during the night, I woke up. My fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow around the camp. And then I heard it, soft, almost too quiet to notice at first. Footsteps. They weren't close, just at the edge of where my firelight faded into darkness. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't an animal. I know the difference. Animals move with caution, but not like this. This was something moving with intention, pausing between steps like it was listening, too. I reached for my knife, keeping still, waiting. The footsteps circled, staying just outside the light. My pulse pounded in my ears. I thought about calling out, but something told me not to. Whoever or whatever it wasn't lost. It wasn't some hiker stumbling onto my camp by accident. Minutes passed. The steps stopped. The night stretched on, the embers dimming. I stayed awake until the first light touched the trees. Only then did I move, stepping out of my tent slowly, my knife still in hand. There were no tracks. The ground was too hard, covered in pine needles. But I knew what I heard. I wasn't imagining it. I should have packed up then and left. But I didn't. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal moving strangely. Maybe the quiet had just made me paranoid. So I stayed. The second night was worse. I forced myself to sleep, but it didn't last. Something woke me again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Right outside my tent. Slow, steady breaths. I didn't move. Didn't make a sound. The fire was out completely. My tent was zipped, but the fabric felt too thin, too fragile. I gripped my knife tighter, waiting, my own breathing shallow and quiet. The breaths outside my tent never wavered, just steady, patient. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours. And then, just like the night before, it stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat in my tent, waiting for morning. When the sun finally came up, I made my decision. I was leaving. I stepped outside, knife in hand, scanning the clearing. Nothing. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew better. I packed fast, shoving everything into my bag without care. The entire time I felt watched. The hike back to my truck was brutal. Every step felt heavier. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, standing in the trees, but there was nothing, just the same awful silence. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in and locked the doors the second I got inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste a second getting out of there. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back to check the post, never looked up that location again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I remember that night, the breathing, the footsteps, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left. I never liked camping much, but my brother, Jake, swore it was something I needed to do at least once on my own. It teaches you self-reliance, he said, gives you time to think. I figured it couldn't hurt. So one October weekend, I packed up my gear and drove out to a small, remote campground about 2 hours away from home. It was one of those places that didn't see a lot of visitors after summer, which meant I'd have some real solitude. The place was deep in the woods, far from any major roads. It had a couple of marked campsites, but no running water or electricity. Just a fire pit, a patch of dirt for a tent, and a picnic table. That was it. I picked a site near a slow-moving river, set up my tent, and got a fire going before the sun went down. The air smelled like damp earth and burning wood, and the only sounds were crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. As night fell, the woods became pitch black. There was no light except for my fire and my flashlight, which barely cut through the darkness beyond a few feet. I ate some jerky, sipped a beer, and stared at the flames. It was peaceful, but also a little unnerving being alone out there. Every small noise beyond the firelight made me turn my head. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, probably just small animals, I told myself. The wind. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself up in my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. The woods were so silent I could hear my own heartbeat. Then a sound. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the leaves. They weren't coming from the main trail, but from the dense trees behind my campsite. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. I listened as they stopped just beyond my tent. Silence. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything to happen. But after a few minutes, the sound never came closer. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe a deer passing through. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight was filtering through the trees, and the fire had burned down to ash. I climbed out of my tent, stretching, shaking off the uneasy feeling from the night before. That's when I noticed them. Footprints. Clear, human footprints in the dirt around my campsite. They weren't mine. I had been wearing hiking boots. These were smaller, barefoot. The tracks led from the trees behind my tent, circled around the fire pit, and disappeared back into the woods. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Someone had been here last night, watching me, standing just outside my tent. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling stayed with me. I decided I'd stay one more night, but I'd be more cautious. I spent the day hiking, clearing my head, making sure I wasn't just being paranoid. But when I got back to camp, the unease settled back in. It was too quiet, too still. That night, I kept the fire burning longer. I sat with my back to my tent, facing the woods, gripping my knife tightly. I wasn't about to let whoever or whatever was out there get the jump on me. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, just as I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the trees. I held my breath, my eyes darting around the edge of the woods. Then I saw it, a figure barely visible between the trees. Too dark to make out any details, but unmistakably human. Standing, watching, not moving. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the figure. The moment the beam hit the trees, it was gone. Just gone. No sound, no movement, nothing. Like it had never been there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, knife in hand, fire burning until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The moment it was bright enough to see, I packed up my gear and got the hell out of there. I didn't bother checking the footprints. I didn't want to know. Driving back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been hunted, that someone had been out there in the dark watching me, maybe waiting. I still don't know who or what it was, and I don't think I ever want to find out. I haven't been camping alone since. I had always enjoyed camping alone. There was something about being out in the wild, away from people, surrounded by nothing but trees, wind, and the sound of nature that made me feel at peace. It was an escape from the noise of everyday life. I had camped in several remote locations before, so when I found a small, isolated spot deep in the woods about 20 miles from the nearest town, I didn't think twice about setting up there. It was late September, the kind of weather that was perfect for camping, not too hot during the day, not too cold at night. The trees were starting to change, and the air had that crisp autumn smell. I parked my truck off an old dirt road, hiked a little over a mile into the woods, and found a flat clearing surrounded by trees. It was perfect. I set up my tent, built a fire pit, and gathered enough firewood to last me through the night. The first few hours were exactly what I had hoped for. I cooked some food over the fire, sat back, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a stream trickled. It was peaceful. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I leaned back against a fallen log and watched the fire crackle. Then the quiet started to feel different. Not eerie exactly, just strange. Like the woods were too quiet. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone. There was no one else around to make noise. I decided to turn in early. After making sure the fire was safe, I climbed into my tent, zipped myself inside my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I had been dozing for about an hour when I heard it. A sound. At first, I thought it was just an animal. Maybe a raccoon digging through the leaves or a deer passing through. But then I heard it again, footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but something heavier. Something deliberate. I held my breath and listened. The steps were slow, measured, moving around my campsite. My mind raced. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. This was deep in the woods, far from any trail or popular camping spot. I didn't bring a gun, just a knife and a small hatchet. Not much against an intruder. I sat up, trying to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows against the walls of my tent. I waited, heart pounding. Maybe it was an animal after all. Then, something pressed against the side of my tent. Not a paw, a hand. A full palm, pressing firmly, dragging slowly down the fabric. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My mind screamed at me to do something, to yell, to make myself seem bigger, to let whoever it was know I was armed. But I stayed silent, listening. The hand moved away, and I heard footsteps again. Moving, circling, then nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely breathing, knife in hand, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the tent fabric, and everything was quiet again. I crawled out slowly, knife still in hand, and looked around. The fire had completely died out. My campsite looked untouched, except for one thing. Footprints. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Large, dirty, bare footprints circling my tent. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee, didn't even take time to break down my fire pit. I shoved everything into my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking. Fast. The whole hike back, I felt watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps behind me, but I never saw anything. I reached my truck, threw my gear in the back, and got in, locking the doors the second I sat down. I drove fast, faster than I should have on that narrow dirt road. It wasn't until I reached the highway that I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I never went back to that spot, never told anyone exactly where it was. I still go camping, but never alone, and I always bring a gun. I always loved camping. The quiet of the woods, the smell of pine in the air, the crackling sound of a campfire late at night. It was the perfect escape from the noise of everyday life. That weekend, I decided to go solo. I had been out plenty of times before with friends and family, but this time I wanted the solitude. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual campgrounds. There was a narrow dirt road leading in, mostly used by hunters, but I knew it would get me far enough away from other people. That was the whole point. I packed light, just the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a few meals, water, my knife, a hatchet, and my rifle. I wasn't planning on hunting, but being out there alone, I liked the comfort of having it. You never know what you might run into, and I'm not talking about just animals. The drive took me about 2 hours. The deeper I went into the woods, the rougher the road got. It was barely wide enough for my truck, branches scraping against the sides as I pushed through. Finally, I found a small clearing just off the road. Perfect. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a minute, taking in the silence. There's something about being that deep in the woods. It's peaceful, but at the same time, it makes you feel small, vulnerable even. No cell service, no help if something goes wrong. Just you and the trees. I got out and stretched, breathing in the fresh air. The place was beautiful, thick trees all around, a narrow creek running nearby, and no signs of other people. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going before the sun went down. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili over the fire, listened to the distant sounds of the woods, and stared up at the stars. Around midnight, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. The air was crisp, and I fell asleep quickly, listening to the wind moving through the trees. I woke up to a sound, not loud but close, leaves crunching. I held my breath and listened. Could be a deer, maybe a raccoon sniffing around. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the side of the tent. Nothing. I waited a few minutes, listening, but whatever it was seemed to be gone. I let out a breath, laid back down, and tried to go back to sleep. Morning came, and I found nothing around the tent. No tracks, no signs of anything being disturbed. Maybe I imagined it, maybe not. Either way, I brushed it off and went about my day. I spent the morning hiking, following the creek for a while before looping back to camp. The day was uneventful, just the way I liked it. I gathered more firewood, made some coffee, and read a book by the fire as the sun started setting. That night, I woke up again. Same sound, leaves crunching. This time, it was closer. I sat up, heart pounding. I listened, barely breathing. Then, I heard something else. A low, deliberate breathing just outside the tent. Not an animal. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, took a deep breath, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. I swept the flashlight around. Trees. The fire had died down, but there was enough glow to see the clearing. No movement. I stepped out, knife in one hand, light in the other. The woods were dead silent. Then, just beyond the fire's reach, I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees, tall, motionless, watching me. My stomach dropped. I pointed the light at them, and they stepped back, blending into the darkness. "Hey!" I shouted. My voice sounded small, weak, no response, just silence. I backed toward my tent, keeping my light moving, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I knew they were still there, watching. I climbed back into my tent, zipped it up, and grabbed my rifle. I kept it across my lap, heart hammering, ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, The sun was rising. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. No signs of anyone, no footprints, nothing out of place. But I knew what I saw. I debated packing up and leaving, but something in me refused. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. The day passed uneventfully. I forced myself to go about things as usual, gathered more firewood, checked my surroundings, made sure everything was in order. But as night fell, the unease crept back in. I kept the fire burning longer that night. I stayed up, watching the woods, listening. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, making every shadow move. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I gripped my rifle, turned on my flashlight, and swept the area. Nothing. Then a whisper, low just at the edge of my hearing. Leave. My blood went cold. I jumped up, aimed my rifle toward the trees. Who's there? I yelled. No response. Then another whisper, closer. Go. I didn't hesitate. I kicked dirt onto the fire, grabbed my gear, and threw it into the truck as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, headlights cutting through the darkness. As I turned onto the dirt road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me leave. I didn't stop, didn't breathe until I hit the highway, miles away from that place. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. I don't know why I agreed to go camping alone. Maybe I needed a break, some space, a reset. Maybe I was just tired of my life feeling like a series of repeated days, each one identical to the last. So, I packed my gear, threw it into the back of my truck, and drove 3 hours north to a place I had never been before. Somewhere quiet. I found a spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest person. The trees were thick, tall, their branches tangled together, blocking most of the sky. It felt untouched, like people hadn't set foot there in years. I liked that. It made me feel separate from the world, like I had disappeared for a while. The first day was fine. I set up my tent near a small clearing, made a fire, cooked some food. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustling of an animal in the brush. I wasn't scared. I had camped before and I had everything I needed: a knife, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a full can of bear spray just in case. But as the sun dipped below the tree line, I felt something I couldn't shake, an uneasiness, the kind that made my stomach tighten for no reason. I ignored it, chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. I wasn't used to absolute silence. Even at night, my house had noises, cars in the distance, the hum of the fridge, the pipes creaking. Out here, the silence was thick, almost heavy. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. It wasn't easy. I kept waking up, listening. The woods weren't silent anymore. I heard twigs snapping, leaves crunching. It wasn't wind. Wind moves through trees. This was different. Footsteps, something moving. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. But the steps were slow, deliberate, not like a four-legged creature, but something walking, something moving carefully, like it didn't want to be heard. I gripped my knife inside my sleeping bag, every muscle in my body tense. My heart pounded in my ears. I thought about calling out, but I didn't want to. Something about this moment told me not to make a sound. Just listen. The steps moved around the tent, circling, stopping, then moving again. I barely breathed, then silence. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, waiting for another sound, another movement. Nothing. At some point, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside my tent. My fire pit had been disturbed. The rocks I had placed in a perfect ring were scattered, some tossed a few feet away. But what made my skin crawl was the footprints. They were in the dirt, clear as day. Not animal tracks, not paws, bare feet, human. I looked around, scanning the woods. Nothing, just trees stretching in every direction. I felt watched, exposed, but there was no one there. I told myself it had to be some lost hiker, someone passing through. Maybe they saw my camp and got curious. But why wouldn't they say something? Why would they walk around my tent in the middle of the night and then leave? I wanted to pack up and go home, but I told myself I was overreacting. I wasn't going to let some stranger ruin my trip. So I stayed. The second night, I kept my fire going longer. I figured if someone or something was out there, the light might keep them away. But as I sat by the fire, something felt wrong. The woods were too quiet. The normal sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl were gone. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I decided to go to bed early, hoping I'd sleep through the night without waking up to more footsteps. I didn't. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine, not inside the tent, just outside. It was soft, slow, like someone was crouched right outside, trying not to be heard. I felt my entire body lock up. I gripped my knife, willing myself to stay quiet. I wanted to turn on my flashlight, but I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. Then the zipper of my tent moved. Not fast, not sudden, just a slight pull. I shot up, yanking my flashlight from my bag and clicking it on. The light spilled through the thin fabric of the tent, casting shadows. The breathing stopped. Silence. I waited, listening, holding my knife so tight my hand ached. Then, footsteps. Slow at first, then faster. Something running. I held my breath, waiting. The steps faded into the distance. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. Then I packed my things, fast. I didn't eat, didn't drink. Just stuffed my gear into my bag and started hiking back to my truck. The whole time I felt watched. When I reached my truck, I didn't waste time. I threw my bag in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I drove down the dirt road, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. A figure, standing at the tree line, far back, almost out of sight. I didn't stop. I didn't look twice. I just drove. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. I don't want to know. I haven't gone camping alone since. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was the way the guys kept pushing, saying I never did anything fun anymore, how I was always too busy with work or too caught up in the stress of life. Maybe it was just easier to give in than keep making excuses. Either way, I agreed, and 3 days later, I was crammed in the back of a truck, headed out into the middle of nowhere with 3 guys I hadn't seen in years. They weren't bad guys, just people I had grown apart from. College, jobs, life in general. We had all taken different paths. But now, here we were, packed into Josh's old F-150, driving deeper and deeper into the woods, looking for the perfect camping spot. The drive was long, and as the roads became more narrow, the trees pressing in from both sides, I felt something shift in my stomach. A feeling, small at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind, telling me I should have stayed home. But I ignored it. Just nerves, I told myself. I wasn't used to this anymore, that was all. After what felt like hours, Josh pulled off onto an overgrown dirt path, the tires bouncing over rocks and uneven ground. "This is it," he said, grinning as he killed the engine. I climbed out, stretching my legs, looking around. Trees towered above us, their branches tangled together so tightly that the sunlight barely made it through. The air was thick, damp with the smell of moss and old leaves. The place was isolated, completely silent except for the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. We set up camp near a small clearing, a fire pit already there from some previous campers. The tent went up quickly, and soon the guys were laughing, cracking open beers, and talking about all the stupid things we used to do in high school. I tried to relax, but something about the place felt off. Not in an obvious way, just enough to keep me on edge. By the time the sun set, the fire was roaring, the warmth cutting through the growing chill in the air. We sat around it, joking, drinking, the usual camping stuff. The woods around us were pitch black, the only light coming from the fire. Then the noises started. first, it was just twigs snapping. Normal, I told myself. Could be a deer, a raccoon, anything. But then the sound changed. Footsteps. Not quick, darting movements like an animal. Slow, deliberate steps, circling just beyond the reach of the firelight. I tried to shake it off, but I could tell the others heard it too. The laughter died down, replaced by forced conversation, all of us pretending we weren't listening. Josh grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness. Still, the feeling in my gut twisted tighter. Eventually, we crawled into the tent. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows against the thin fabric. The others fell asleep fast, their breathing slow and steady. But I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard I thought it would wake the others. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear breathing low, steady. Then, slowly, the zipper on the tent started to move. I bolted upright, my hand grabbing at the knife I kept in my bag. But before I could do anything, the sound stopped. The breathing was gone, just silence. I sat there for what felt like forever, my body locked in place. I wanted to wake the others, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have dozed off. Morning came, and with it, a feeling of relief. The sun was shining, the fear of the night before feeling almost ridiculous in the light of day. I told myself I imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw the footprints, all around our tent, deep in the dirt, circling. Not animal tracks, human, bare feet. I woke the others, showing them, my voice shaking. They laughed at first, saying it was probably one of us messing around. But when they saw the size of the prints, too big for any of us, they went quiet. We packed up fast, none of us saying what we were all thinking. We needed to get out of there. The drive back felt different. The air in the truck was tense, the jokes and laughter from the ride up gone. No one wanted to talk about what happened. Maybe because it was easier to pretend it was nothing. But I knew someone had been out there watching us, waiting. And that was the last time I ever went camping. I don't know what made me choose that spot to camp. Maybe it was the thick tree cover, the way the leaves rustled softly even when the wind was barely there. Maybe it was the way the ground sloped gently downward toward a dried-up creek bed, making it feel hidden from everything else. I had been hiking all day, moving deeper and deeper into the forest, farther than I'd ever been before. There was something peaceful about being alone out there, miles away from people, cars, and noise. I set up my tent in the flattest spot I could find, just a few feet from the old creek bed. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere out in the distance. I built a small fire, just enough to cook a simple meal. As the sun lowered behind the trees, the shadows stretched long and dark across the ground. I should have felt calm. I usually did when I camped alone, but there was something off that night. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Just a feeling, like the quiet was too deep, too complete. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired from hiking all day. I forced myself to eat, even though my stomach felt tight. By the time I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, the night had fully settled in, thick and absolute. The stars were hidden behind the trees, and without the fire, the darkness pressed in close. I listened to the sounds of the forest, waiting for sleep to take over. Then I heard it, a rustling noise, not far from my tent. At first, I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon searching for scraps. But then I realized something. The sound wasn't random, like an animal moving through the underbrush. It was slow, purposeful, like someone was stepping carefully, trying not to make noise. I held my breath and strained my ears, but the sound stopped. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I don't know how long I lay there, just listening. Eventually, sleep took over, but it wasn't deep. It was the kind where you hover on the edge, aware of every sound, every shift in the air. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it again. Breathing. Not my own. Not an animal's. Just outside the thin nylon of my tent. Slow and steady. I went completely still, my heart hammering. I told myself it was the wind, the trees, something natural. But I knew better. I reached for the knife I always kept next to me when I camped. My fingers wrapped around the handle, but I didn't move. I just listened. The breathing was deep, steady, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't in any hurry. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stayed awake for hours, gripping the knife, barely even blinking. The silence stretched on. Eventually, as the first light of dawn crept into the sky, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off just for a little while. When I woke up, it was full morning. The air was cool, and everything seemed normal. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But when I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my tent. Slow, deliberate steps pressing deep into the dirt. Not animal prints, human. Bare feet. The size of a man's, maybe bigger. I felt my stomach drop. My skin went cold, even as the morning sun filtered through the trees. Someone had been out there, watching me, standing just inches from where I slept. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. Every second I spent out there exposed made my skin crawl. My brain raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of prank? Had someone followed me into the woods? Or was it worse than that? I didn't wait to find out. I hiked back the way I came, moving faster than I ever had before. Every time a twig snapped or a branch shifted, I spun around, heart pounding. I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me, but I never saw anything. By the time I reached my car, my legs were shaking. I threw my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. Only when I was miles away from the trailhead did I let myself breathe again. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe I don't want to know. But I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I don't know why I agreed to this trip. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to seem like a coward. Either way, I found myself deep in the woods, far from cell service, with only the cold wind and the sound of rustling leaves keeping me company. The plan was simple: 3 nights of camping at an old, semi-abandoned campground that my friend Alex had found online. He was always looking for places that felt untouched, as he put it. This one was way off the beaten path. No paved roads, no marked trails, just an old logging road that we followed for what felt like hours. By the time we got to the campsite, the sun had already started sinking below the trees. The place had a strange, unsettling feel to it. There were a couple of old fire pits, some scattered trash from past campers, but no signs of recent activity. Felt forgotten. The trees were thick, and the undergrowth was dense, like nature was trying to reclaim the area. The only open space was where we set up camp, a small clearing with just enough room for our tents and a fire. The first night was uneventful. We set up camp, built a fire, cooked some food, and settled in. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches creak and groan like they were alive. It was colder than we expected, and the fire was the only thing keeping us from freezing. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping outside my tent. I held my breath and listened. Could have been an animal, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The steps were slow, deliberate, too heavy for a small animal, too light for a bear. They stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, shallow, steady. I stayed completely still. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent just a little. I peeked outside. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow, but there was no sign of anything unusual. The next morning, I didn't say anything. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't Alex's. They were fresh, leading from the trees straight to my tent, and then back into the woods. I felt sick. I showed Alex, but he just laughed it off, saying it was probably just some hunter passing through. But something about it felt wrong. Who walks right up to someone's tent in the middle of the night and just stands there? We decided to stay, though. We had planned for 3 nights, and Alex wasn't going to let a few footprints scare us off. I should have left right then, but I didn't. The second night was worse. I barely slept. Every sound felt like a threat. Every gust of wind made me flinch. At some point, I thought I heard whispers, so faint I couldn't make out the words. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then there were more footsteps, circling the tent this time. Slow, purposeful. I clutched the knife I had brought with me, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped. Silence. And then, just outside the tent, I heard something I will never forget. A low, slow exhale, like someone was standing just inches away from the fabric, breathing right over me. I couldn't take it anymore. I shot up, unzipped the tent, and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing. The fire was nearly dead again, casting only the faintest glow. Alex's tent was zipped up. I whispered his name. No response. Then I saw them. In the dirt, fresh footprints, bare feet, deep impressions like someone had been standing there for a long time. I scanned the woods with my flashlight, my pulse hammering. Nothing. Just trees. Just darkness. I barely slept after that. I sat up with my knife in my lap, staring at the tent door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. By morning, I was done. I told Alex we needed to leave. He was annoyed but agreed when he saw how serious I was. We packed up fast. I felt exposed, like something was watching us from the trees. And then, just as we were about to leave, we found something that made my stomach drop. A single, small pile of ashes near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was an old fire pit, but then I saw what was inside: bones. Small ones, too small to be deer or anything like that. We didn't say a word. We just grabbed our gear and left as fast as we could. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. Maybe it was some drifter, some lunatic living out in the woods. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But those footprints were real. The breathing was real. And the bones, I haven't been camping since. And I don't think I ever will again. I drove up the narrow dirt road, the tires of my truck crunching against loose gravel as I made my way toward the campsite. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend away from everything. Work, phone calls, the constant noise of daily life. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I had planned this trip for months, picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from the busy campgrounds filled with tourists and RVs. This was the kind of solitude I wanted, the kind where I could breathe in the scent of pine and listen to nothing but the wind pushing through the trees. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads were rough, with deep ruts and sharp turns that forced me to slow down. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on my map, the sun had already started its descent behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was a perfect place. A small clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick woods. I killed the engine, stepped out, and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my back from the drive. I set up my tent quickly, not wanting to do it in the dark. It was an easy task. I had done it so many times before. The fire pit was next. I gathered some dry wood, stacked it neatly, and lit a small fire. The flames flickered and popped, sending small embers floating into the night air. I sat down in my camp chair, cracked open a cold beer, and took a deep breath. This was exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sounds of the creek and the occasional rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. I woke up just as the sky was beginning to lighten, the air cold and crisp. I made coffee over the fire, the rich smell mixing with the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine needles. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area a bit. I had my GPS and a good sense of direction, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I hiked for hours, following old game trails and wandering deeper into the woods. The deeper I went, the less familiar everything felt. The trees were thicker here, the undergrowth denser. It felt untouched, like no one had been here in a long time. At one point, I stumbled across something odd. A small clearing with a few broken branches arranged in a strange pattern. It was probably nothing, just the result of a storm or falling trees, but it unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I turned back, checking my GPS to make sure I was heading in the right direction. But something felt off. The trail didn't look the same, and I was certain I hadn't crossed that particular fallen log on my way in. I tried to stay calm, retraced my steps, and eventually found my way back to camp. The whole thing left a bad feeling in my gut, but I pushed it aside. I was probably just overthinking it. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no sounds of insects, just silence. The fire crackled, but beyond that, nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. I barely slept. Every little sound jerked me awake. At one point, I thought I heard something moving just beyond the tree line. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the darkness. Nothing. The trees stood still, unmoving, their trunks stretching up into the black sky. I convinced myself it was a deer or some other animal and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found something near my tent that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not animal tracks, not my own, but human footprints. They circled my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I stared at them, my mind racing. I had seen no one since I got here. No cars, no distant campfires, nothing. Someone had been here, watching me as I slept. I packed up fast, stuffing my gear into my backpack, heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it could be a hiker who had passed through, maybe even a ranger checking the area. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whoever it was had been quiet, careful. Too careful. I started the truck and got the hell out of there, driving faster than I should have down the rough, winding road. My hands were tight on the wheel, my eyes scanning the trees. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on a paved road, back where I could see other cars and the occasional house. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't want to know. But I do know this. I won't be going back to that forest. Not alone. Not ever. The dirt road stretched ahead of me, lined with towering pine trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had been driving for nearly 4 hours, and my back ached from sitting in the truck's stiff seat. The GPS had lost signal nearly an hour ago, but according to my paper map, the campsite wasn't much farther. I had been planning this trip for months, just a few days alone in the wilderness, away from work, people, and the noise of everyday life. The solitude was something I had been craving, and this isolated campsite seemed perfect for it. There wouldn't be anyone else around for miles. No distractions. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. The road narrowed as I turned down the final stretch. The trees pressed in close, their branches scraping against the sides of my truck. The dirt beneath my tires was loose, and I could feel them slide slightly as I maneuvered down the steep path. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was smaller than I expected, just enough space for my truck and a small tent. A fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by a few moss-covered logs for seating. The lake was just beyond the tree line, its dark waters barely visible through the gaps in the trees. I shut off the engine and stepped out, stretching my stiff limbs. The silence was immediate. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no music. Just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent a few feet from the fire pit. The ground was firm but covered in a thick layer of pine needles, making it soft enough to sleep on. Once my tent was up, I gathered some firewood and stacked it neatly. The sun had almost fully set by the time I finished, the sky now a deep shade of purple. I started the fire, watching as the flames crackled and popped, sending a shower of embers into the air. The warmth felt good against the cool night air. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, eating in silence as I listened to the sounds of the forest. An owl hooted in the distance, its voice echoing through the trees. The lake was calm, the surface undisturbed. As I sat there, enjoying the peace, a strange feeling crept over me. It was subtle at first, just an odd sensation at the back of my mind, like I was being watched. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there, just darkness and trees. I shook the feeling off. It was natural to feel uneasy out here alone. The mind played tricks when it wasn't distracted. I cleaned up my campsite, making sure there were no food scraps left out to attract animals. Then I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. The inside was warm and smelled of fabric and earth. I lay down on my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the tent walls. Sleep didn't come easily. The feeling of being watched still lingered, making my skin crawl. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals. A deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake the unease. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I must have finally drifted off. I woke up suddenly, my body rigid with fear. The fire had burned low, casting only faint light. Something had woken me. I listened carefully. The forest was silent, too silent. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, owls, the wind, had stopped. Then I heard it, a soft crunch, footsteps, slow, deliberate. They were close, just outside the tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps moved around my campsite, circling. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly. My mind raced. Was it an animal? No, animals didn't move like that. Then silence. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying so still. I waited, listening. Nothing. Slowly, I reached for the zipper of my tent. I moved it just an inch, peeking out. The fire was almost completely out, only glowing embers remaining. The woods were dark, the trees standing still. There was no sign of anything. I scanned the area, my breath shallow. Then I saw it. Bare footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They led from the tree line to my tent. I grabbed my knife, my mind racing. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been outside my tent, watching me. I thought about packing up and leaving, but driving the rough road out of here in the dark wasn't an option. I had no choice but to wait until morning. I sat up the rest of the night, gripping my knife, staring at the tent flap. Every sound made my pulse jump. Eventually, dawn came. The first light of morning trickled through the trees. The footprints were still there, clear in the dirt. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't bother eating, just shoved everything into my truck. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye near the tree line. A single piece of cloth caught on a low branch, dark red, stained. I didn't wait to inspect it. I jumped into my truck, started the engine, and drove away, my tires kicking up dust. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I made my way back to civilization, the fear didn't fade. The thought that someone had been out there, watching me, moving around my tent while I slept, haunted me. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, and I never wanted to find out. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I've always loved camping. The fresh air, the quiet, the smell of pine trees. It's the kind of peace you can't find anywhere else. So, when I finally had a free weekend, I packed my gear and drove out to a remote spot deep in the national forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing near a small lake I had found on a map, the kind of place where you wouldn't see another soul for miles. Perfect. The drive took longer than I expected. The last stretch was nothing but rough dirt roads, barely wide enough for my truck. The forest closed in tight on both sides, branches scraping against the windows. I had to go slow, watching for deep ruts and fallen branches. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping low, staining the sky orange and pink. I set up my tent near the water, just far enough back to avoid the damp ground. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the sounds of the wilderness. The occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant chirp of crickets. It was perfect, but as the last light faded and darkness settled over the forest, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The usual nighttime noises were still there, but there was something else. Feeling like I was being watched. I shook it off. Being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind. I was just on edge from the long drive. I stoked the fire and made sure my knife was within reach before climbing into my tent. The air was crisp, the kind that makes for perfect sleeping weather. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the distant croak of frogs. Eventually, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me. There was no loud noise, no sudden movement, just a feeling. I opened my eyes and listened. The fire had burned low, its glow barely visible through the tent fabric. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves, just absolute stillness. Then the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, moving just outside my tent. My body went rigid. My mind raced. A bear? A coyote? No, those didn't move like this. These were human footsteps, deliberate, measured. I reached for my knife, heart pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. A long pause, my breath caught in my throat. Then, the sound of fabric shifting, like fingers running over the nylon of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. And then, just as slowly as they came, the footsteps retreated, moving away, fading into the trees. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle locked. Eventually, the forest came back to life. Crickets, wind, the distant hoot of an owl. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came and I forced myself out of the tent. My fire was nothing but cold ash. The woods looked normal, peaceful even. But when I circled my campsite, my stomach dropped. Footprints, human, large, deep impressions in the dirt, circling my tent, stopping right at the entrance. I wasn't alone out here last night. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been right outside my tent, inches away. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my truck with shaking hands. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted out of there. The drive back was a blur. The rough road bouncing my truck so hard I nearly lost control more than once. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved road, back where I could see houses and gas stations and other people. I never went back to that spot, never even checked the map to see where exactly I had been. I didn't want to know, because if I knew, I might be tempted to go back. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, next time, whoever was out there wouldn't just be watching. I always loved camping. It felt like the only way to disconnect from the constant noise of life and just breathe. The crackling fire, the scent of pine, the cold air against my skin. All of it made me feel alive in a way that nothing else could. But one trip changed everything for me. One trip made me question if I'd ever feel safe out there again. It was late October, and I had been planning a solo camping trip for months. I had experience. I wasn't some beginner who didn't know how to set up a tent or start a fire. I had been doing this since I was a kid, so there was no reason to worry. I picked a remote spot, deep in a national forest, away from designated campsites. I wanted solitude, just me, the woods, and the quiet. I arrived in the afternoon. The drive had been long, mostly winding dirt roads that felt like they hadn't been maintained in years. My truck kicked up dust as I pulled onto the shoulder of the narrow path, parking in a small clearing. I grabbed my backpack, rifle, and a few essentials before making my way down the unmarked trail that I had mapped out weeks before. The hike to my campsite was about 2 miles in. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. That was the whole point. No people, no distractions. Just the sound of leaves crunching under my boots and the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees. I found a decent spot near a small creek and set up my tent, making sure to clear the area of rocks and sticks. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I got a fire going and ate a simple meal, jerky, some nuts, and a granola bar. The temperature dropped fast as the last bit of light faded. It was just me and the fire now. The night was still. Too still. Usually, the woods had a rhythm, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, maybe a distant coyote. But there was nothing, just the fire popping and my own breathing. I tried to shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. I decided to call it a night. I climbed into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and let my body relax. Sleep came quickly. I don't know what woke me up, but when I opened my eyes, I was instantly alert. The fire outside had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light against the walls of my tent. My ears strained for any sound, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then I heard it, a footstep, not an animal, not the wind, a deliberate, slow step, then another. It was close, too close. My mind raced. No one else should be out here. No one even knew I was here except a couple of friends I had told before I left. My rifle was just outside the tent, leaning against a log by the fire, too far to grab quickly. I moved as quietly as I could, reaching for the knife I kept strapped to my pack. My fingers gripped the handle, and I held my breath, waiting. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the woods playing tricks on me. Then, a shadow moved across the faint light from the embers. My blood ran cold. Someone was out there. I stayed still, listening. Whoever it was, they weren't making any more noise. No footsteps, no breathing, just standing there, watching. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. My mind screamed at me to do something. But what? If I unzipped the tent, I'd make noise. If I waited, they might make a move first. I tightened my grip on the knife and took a slow, quiet breath. Then, the footsteps started again, but they were moving away. Slow, steady, until they faded completely. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed still, gripping the knife until my hand ached. The fire outside had all but died, leaving me in almost complete darkness. I waited until the first signs of morning light before I finally moved. I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked out. Nothing. No sign of anyone. My rifle was still there. The campsite looked untouched. But something wasn't right. I stood up and scanned the ground. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Clear, fresh footprints in the dirt, circling my campsite. Not just walking by, circling, watching. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone last night. Someone had been standing just feet from my tent, listening to me sleep. I packed up fast. No breakfast, no fire. Just threw everything into my pack and got the hell out of there. The entire hike back, I felt like I was being watched. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves had my heart pounding. I kept my rifle in my hands, ready, but I never saw anyone. When I got back to my truck, I locked the doors the second I climbed in. I sat there for a moment trying to slow my breathing. Then something on my windshield caught my eye. A single muddy handprint, smudged, fingers spread wide. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. I never went camping alone again. It started with an idea that seemed harmless. A weekend camping trip, just me and the quiet of the woods. I had done it before many times. Being alone in the wilderness wasn't something that scared me. It was something I enjoyed. No distractions, no noise, just me and nature. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, extra batteries, enough food and water for 3 days. I didn't plan on going too deep into the woods, just far enough to escape the sounds of the world. I picked a place I had been to before, a remote section of forest about 2 hours from my house. It wasn't a popular spot. I had never seen another camper there, and that was what I liked about it. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive was smooth, the dirt roads leading deep into the woods just rough enough to remind me that I was far from civilization. I parked in the clearing where the trailhead began and set out on foot. It was a familiar path, winding through tall trees, the ground soft beneath my boots. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Felt right. I reached my campsite about an hour before sunset. A small clearing surrounded by trees, a short distance from a narrow stream. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The first night was uneventful. I slept well, waking only once to the distant sound of something moving through the underbrush, probably a deer. I had been in the woods enough to recognize the difference between small animals and something larger. This was large but not threatening. I drifted back to sleep easily. The next morning, I took my time making coffee, enjoying the quiet. I spent the day hiking, exploring areas of the forest I hadn't been to before. I found an old, overgrown path and followed it for a while before turning back. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was starting to lower in the sky. I built another fire, cooked a quick meal, and let the fatigue of the day settle into my bones. That night, I woke up again. This time, it was different. The sound that had woken me wasn't far away. It was close, too close, right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see shadows shifting through the fabric of my tent. Someone was out there. I stayed still, heart pounding. I thought about calling out, but my gut told me not to. Instead, I reached for the knife I always kept next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps moved slowly, circling the tent. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. Then they stopped, right at the entrance. I gripped the knife tighter, barely breathing. The seconds dragged on. I expected the zipper to start moving, for the tent to be pulled open. I braced myself, ready to lunge if I had to, but nothing happened. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, moving away, slowly, deliberately. I stayed awake for hours after that, waiting, listening, but whoever it was didn't come back. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent, gripping the knife in one hand. I scanned the area. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the ground outside my tent was covered in footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. My stomach twisted. There was no reason for someone to be out here, barefoot in the middle of the night. No reason for them to be watching me. I packed up quickly. I had planned on staying another night, but that was no longer an option. Something about those footprints unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I had been in the woods alone more times than I could count, but this felt different. I wanted to leave. The hike back to my car was faster than usual. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but the woods were empty. At least they looked empty. I reached my car, threw my gear in the back, and got in. The sense of relief that washed over me as I turned the key was overwhelming. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. I pulled onto the dirt road, heading back to civilization. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just some drifter, maybe someone living off the grid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had been watching me, studying me, and they had been waiting. I haven't been back to that spot since. I still go camping, but never alone. Never again alone. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. A weekend alone in the woods, just me, my gear, and the silence of nature. No work emails, no city noise, no responsibilities beyond keeping a fire going and making sure my tent stayed dry. The spot I picked wasn't a well-known campsite. It was deep in the national forest, about 10 miles off a rough service road. I had found it last year while hiking and marked it on my map. It was perfect. A small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by thick pine trees. The nearest marked trail was a good mile away. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted. Secluded, peaceful, and untouched. I got there early in the afternoon, parked my truck at the closest pull-off, and hiked in with my gear. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The sun filtered through the trees, making shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was quiet. No distant voices, no hum of traffic, just the occasional rustling of leaves as a breeze passed through. I set up my tent near the creek, collected enough firewood to last through the night, and settled in. I cooked a quick meal over my small camp stove, then sat by the fire as the sun dropped below the treetops. The quiet was almost too much. I wasn't used to it. Even at night, the city never really went silent. But here, once the wind died down, I could hear every little sound. The creak of a branch, the rustling of some small animal in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up my tent, and lay there listening to the sounds of the forest. It took me a while to fall asleep. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up suddenly to a sound that wasn't part of the normal forest noises. Footsteps, not the quick, darting steps of an animal. These were slow, deliberate, heavy. Someone walking. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, my heart pounding, ears straining for any other sounds. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a deer or something moving through the underbrush. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The tent glowed softly from the inside, but nothing moved outside. I unzipped the flap just a little and peered out. The fire was just embers now, casting a faint orange glow on the ground. The trees stood tall and still. I didn't see anything. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch falling, maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. I zipped the tent back up and lay back down, trying to calm my breathing. Eventually, I fell asleep again. The next morning was clear and cool. I got up, made coffee, and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. It was stupid. I was out here alone. There was nobody else around. It had to be an animal. But as I walked around the campsite, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not mine. The ground near my tent was soft from the damp night air, and I could see them clearly. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, human, and they led from the edge of the clearing to my tent. I stood there, staring at them. My first thought was that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I had somehow made them myself. But I hadn't walked around barefoot, and they were too big to be mine anyway. I followed them back toward the trees, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. I felt exposed, like someone had been watching me, maybe still was. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. My plan was to stay another night, but there was no way in hell I was doing that now. I wanted to be out of there before anything else happened. I hoisted my pack onto my back and started toward my truck. The whole hike back, I felt like I was being watched. Every time a branch snapped or the wind rustled the trees, I turned my head, scanning the woods. When I reached my truck, I tossed my gear into the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But when I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. At the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure. They were barefoot. They didn't move. I threw the truck into drive and tore out of there, my tires kicking up gravel. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But there was nothing, just trees and the empty dirt road stretching behind me. I didn't go back. I never will. I don't know why I agreed to go on that trip. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the city, the need to get away from work, or just the pull of the woods calling me back to something simpler. My buddy Alex had suggested it. 3 days out in the wilderness, no cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. I wasn't exactly a survivalist, but I knew my way around a campsite well enough. So, I packed my gear, double-checked my supplies, and met Alex at the trailhead early that Friday morning. The drive out was uneventful. We took a winding road deep into the state forest, passing through small towns and empty stretches of highway. The deeper we went, the more the modern world seemed to fade away. By the time we pulled up to the dirt parking lot at the base of the trail, there was nothing but trees, hills, and silence. We shouldered our packs and set off. The first few miles were easy, wide, well-trodden paths leading deeper into the woods. Sunlight filtered through the canopy. Birds called in the distance, and the fresh air felt good. The plan was simple. Hike 10 miles in, find a good spot near the river, set up camp, and just exist for a while. The first sign that something was wrong came about 4 miles in. The trees around us started to change. Less undergrowth, darker bark, a different smell in the air. It wasn't anything obvious, just a shift in the way the forest felt. I didn't mention it to Alex. He was ahead of me, focused on the trail, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. But then we found the first sign. A deer carcass, ripped apart, bones scattered across the trail. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Maybe a day or two. I stopped, my stomach twisting. I'd seen dead animals in the woods before, but something about this one was wrong. The ribs had been cracked open, the spine gnawed down, the head missing entirely. Cougar, Alex said, finally noticing I had stopped. Maybe, I muttered, but something about it didn't sit right. Predators usually drag their kills off the trail, hide them. This felt like something different, a warning. We kept moving. The feeling in my gut didn't go away. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I told myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination, but I started noticing more things. Broken branches in strange places, scratches on tree trunks at eye level, the smell of something rotting, but no visible source. By the time we reached the river, I was on edge, but Alex seemed fine, so I pushed it aside. We set up camp on a flat patch of land near the water, got a fire going, cooked some food. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I finally started to relax. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was silence. The kind of deep, unnatural silence that makes your skin crawl. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves, just nothing. I lay still, barely breathing, listening. Then, from somewhere in the trees, the sound of something moving. Not a deer, not a bear. Something slow, careful, watching. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, Alex stirred in his tent. The movement outside stopped, dead silent again. I sat there for what felt like an eternity before I finally convinced myself it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks. Eventually, I fell back asleep. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The sun was bright, the birds were back, and the night before seemed like a bad dream. Alex didn't mention anything weird, so I figured he hadn't heard it. We spent the day hiking, fishing, enjoying the quiet. But that night, it happened again. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I woke up to the sound of something breathing. Not close, but not far either. Just beyond the tree line. A slow, steady inhale and exhale, like something standing there, watching. I reached for my knife, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving toward the tent. I held my breath, gripping the handle of my knife so tight my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could feel it, something there, just on the other side of the thin fabric. Then nothing. Silence stretched on forever. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, after what felt like hours, I heard it step away. The sound faded into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn. I told Alex we needed to leave. He laughed at first, but when he saw the look on my face, he stopped. We packed up fast, barely speaking, and hit the trail. About 2 miles from camp, we found something new. Pile of bones. Not animal bones, human. They were old, bleached by the sun, scattered like something had been picking at them. A tattered scrap of cloth clung to one of the larger pieces. My stomach turned. Alex swore under his breath. We didn't stop. We didn't talk. We just walked, fast. By the time we reached the car, we were drenched in sweat, breathless, paranoid. We threw our packs in the trunk and peeled out of that parking lot without a second glance. Neither of us has been back since. We don't talk about it. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I swear I hear it again. The slow, steady sound of breathing just beyond the tree line. The sun hung low in the sky when I pulled into the campground, the last slivers of daylight stretching across the tops of the pine trees. The place was nearly empty, just the way I liked it. It was late in the season, early October, and most people had already packed away their tents for the year. I chose a secluded spot near the lake, where the ground was soft but firm, perfect for setting up camp. There was a chill in the air, a warning of the colder nights ahead, but I came prepared with thick blankets and layers of clothing. After setting up my tent and securing my supplies, I gathered some firewood from the surrounding forest. The silence of the place was almost unsettling. I had camped alone plenty of times before, but something about the stillness felt different this time. No distant sounds of hikers, no murmurs of other campers, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I built a fire, letting the flames crackle and send shadows dancing along the trees. As I sat back in my chair, eating a simple meal of canned beans and jerky, the unease from earlier started to fade. There was something peaceful about being alone out here. No distractions, no noise from the modern world. Just me and the wild. It wasn't until I was finishing my food that I noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, wind through the trees, distant splashes in the lake, had gone completely silent. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Not even the distant rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. The fire crackled, filling the silence, but that was it. I shook it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had passed through, scaring the smaller creatures into silence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I made sure my fire was strong and secure before zipping myself into my tent for the night. I slept lightly, waking up at every small sound. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something outside my tent, a soft, deliberate shuffling. It wasn't the wind, nor was it an animal rustling through the leaves. This was slow, heavy, like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I gripped my pocket knife, ready for anything, but I didn't dare move. Whoever, whatever, was out there stood motionless for what felt like hours. Then, just as quietly as it came, the sound moved away, back into the trees. I barely slept after that. At first light, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The air was thick with fog, and everything was damp from the morning dew. My fire had burned low, but that wasn't what caught my attention. Just outside my tent, no more than a foot away, were deep footprints in the soft dirt. Human footprints, barefoot. I swallowed hard, scanning the area. The prints led away from my tent, disappearing into the trees. I tried to tell myself it was just some lost hiker, maybe someone who had wandered too close in the night without realizing it. But deep down, I knew better. I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things quickly, my eyes darting to the trees every few seconds. I felt watched. The feeling didn't leave as I shoved my gear into my truck and started the engine. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints. The way they had stopped so close to my tent. The way they had lingered. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, either. But I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone that night. Someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting, and I don't think they ever meant to just pass by. I had always liked camping. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being far away from everything. It was my way of escaping the noise of life, of getting away from work, bills, and the endless cycle of responsibilities. That weekend, I had planned a solo trip to a remote spot deep in the woods. I had camped alone before, so I wasn't worried. I just wanted a few days of peace. I picked a place I had never been to before, an old forest reserve about 3 hours from home. It wasn't a popular spot, and that's what I liked about it. No loud families, no groups of drunk teenagers. Just me, my tent, and the sound of the trees. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, my car packed with supplies. The road turned from pavement to dirt, then to something barely passable with deep ruts and thick overgrowth. My tires crunched over loose gravel and fallen leaves as I made my way deeper into the woods. After a while, I found a good spot, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. The trees were thick on all sides, towering and dense. Felt secluded, perfect. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going before sunset. I ate a simple meal, just a can of beans and some bread, then sat by the fire, listening to the forest. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. Crickets chirped. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. It was peaceful. Then, as the fire crackled, I heard something else. Something off. A soft rustling in the underbrush, like something moving through the trees. Not the wind, something bigger. I held my breath, listening. It stopped. Just the normal night sounds again. Probably a raccoon or a deer. Nothing to worry about. But the feeling stayed, an itch in the back of my mind. I shook it off and went to bed, zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The night was colder than I expected, and the ground felt harder than it should have. I turned a few times, trying to get comfortable, and eventually drifted off. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. Something had woken me. I lay there, still listening. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the forest was silent. Too silent. No crickets, no wind, just stillness. Then there it was again, the sound of movement outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, footsteps. I told myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Animals don't move like that. They don't step cautiously, 1 foot at a time, like something trying not to be heard. My breathing slowed as I strained to listen. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds, as if something was listening, too. Then the sound stopped. Silence. My ears rang with it. I lay there for what felt like forever, my body rigid. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have drifted back to sleep because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the tent fabric. Morning. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Everything looked normal. My gear was undisturbed. The trees stood tall, indifferent. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had dreamt the whole thing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to check the perimeter just to be sure. I walked a slow circle around my campsite, looking for tracks, signs of anything unusual. First, there was nothing, just dirt and fallen leaves. But then, about 15 feet from my tent, I saw them, footprints. Not mine, barefoot, human. The prints were deep, the toes pressing into the earth. They led from the treeline to my tent, circling it. Then they disappeared back into the woods. My stomach tightened. I stood there for a long time, staring. I had come out here alone. No one knew exactly where I was. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving back. But I had driven all this way, set everything up. Maybe there was a logical explanation. A lost hiker, some local exploring the woods. Someone messing with me? But how would they know I was here? I convinced myself it was nothing and forced myself to go about my day. I went on a hike, keeping my pocket knife in my hand the whole time. I fished in the creek but couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the trees, the shadows between them. The feeling of being watched never left. That night, I built my fire bigger. I ate quickly, barely tasting my food, and sat close to the flames, my back to my tent. I didn't want to sleep. I didn't want to be vulnerable again. The fire crackled, pushing back the dark. I stayed up as long as I could, until my body couldn't fight sleep anymore. I woke up to the sound of breathing, not mine, just outside the tent. Slow, steady breaths. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My mind raced. My knife was in my backpack, just out of reach. My car was too far. The fire had burned down again. I was trapped. Then the breathing stopped, and the zipper of my tent moved. Not fast, not yanked open, just tested. A slow pull, an inch at a time, as if whoever was out there wanted to see if I was awake. I bolted upright, grabbed the zipper from inside, and yanked it closed as hard as I could. My other hand fumbled for my knife, my fingers shaking. The breathing was gone. The footsteps were back, moving away this time into the trees. Slow, unhurried. I didn't sleep again. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up, my hands still trembling. I didn't eat. I didn't even take down my tent properly. I just shoved everything into the car and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, back in civilization. I pulled into a gas station, my heart still racing. I sat there for a long time just breathing. I never went back to that spot. I never even looked it up again. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was something much worse. It was real. I always loved camping. The idea of being out in the wilderness, away from people, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of nature. It was peaceful. It was something I did often, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend. I never thought anything of it. That changed last summer. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted to go somewhere secluded, deep into the woods where I wouldn't have to worry about noisy campers or drunk teenagers blaring music at night. I found a spot near a small, unnamed lake deep in the national forest. It was a good distance from any main trails, and after checking maps and satellite images, I saw no signs of campsites nearby. Perfect. I packed everything I needed. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days, my knife, hatchet, and a small handgun, just in case. I wasn't afraid of animals, but I liked to be prepared. I drove out early in the morning, parked my truck at the edge of a dirt road, and hiked in about 4 miles. The hike was tough with all my gear, but the spot was worth it. A small clearing with just enough space for my tent, a fire pit, and a view of the lake. The water was calm, the air was fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. Felt right. The first day was uneventful. I set up camp, gathered wood, and fished a little. The lake was teeming with life, and I caught a few small fish, which I cooked over the fire. As the sun set, the forest grew darker, quieter. The temperature dropped slightly, but my fire kept me warm. I sat there for hours, listening to the crackling flames and the occasional rustling in the brush. Probably just small animals. I didn't think much of it. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. I didn't know why. The fire had died down, but the coals still glowed faintly. I sat up, listening. Nothing. No wind, no rustling. Just silence. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stayed still, heart pounding. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I listened for a while, but the sounds didn't continue. After a few minutes, I lay back down and forced myself to sleep. The next day, I explored a little. Walked around the lake, found some animal tracks. Deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote. Normal stuff. The day was relaxing. I fished some more, read a book by the water, and just enjoyed the quiet. But as the sun started to set, that feeling crept back in, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The woods can do that. That night, I made sure my fire was bigger. I sat close to it, watching the darkness. The woods seemed different at night, like they were hiding something just beyond my vision. I tried to shake the feeling. I was fine. Nothing was out there. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, I heard it clearly. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. They came from the treeline, maybe 50 feet away. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my hand resting on my knife. Minutes passed. Then a soft crunch, closer this time. I stood up, my flashlight scanning the woods. Hello! My voice sounded small, weak, no answer. I stared into the trees, waiting. Nothing moved, but I knew something was there. I backed up to my tent, grabbed my gun, and sat by the fire. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I looked around the area. I found footprints. Human. They weren't mine. The dirt near the treeline had been disturbed, like someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. My stomach turned. I wasn't alone. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone was lost. I convinced myself there was a reasonable explanation. I decided to stay one more night. Before dark, I set up some traps around my camp. Simple things with fishing line and cans to make noise if something moved nearby. I kept my fire big, kept my knife close, and waited. Around midnight, the cans rattled. I jumped up, gun in hand, flashlight cutting through the dark. Nothing. I listened, breathing hard. Then I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Somewhere close. My skin went cold. I turned in circles, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Then, footsteps. Running. Something moving fast through the trees, circling my camp. I aimed my gun but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. Silence. The fire crackled. My own heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then a whisper, right behind me. I spun around, gun up, but there was nothing. Just trees. Just dark. My body was screaming at me to run, but I stayed frozen. Then, in the distance, deeper in the woods, I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees, watching. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything I could into it, and ran. I left the tent, the food, the extra gear. I didn't care. I ran until my lungs burned, until I reached my truck. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out of there. The drive home was a blur. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me. But the road was empty. When I got home, I looked at the maps again. There were no trails near that lake. No cabins. No campsites. I checked reports, no missing people, no known threats. Just empty forest. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. I don't know why I thought solo camping was a good idea. I've camped plenty of times before, always with family or friends, but this was different. It was just me, my truck, a tent, and miles of empty forest. That was the appeal, though, to get away, to clear my head, to prove to myself that I could do it alone. I picked a spot deep in Hoosier National Forest, far from any established campgrounds. It was early October, and the air had that crisp bite that makes a fire feel like a necessity rather than just a luxury. I drove my truck down a narrow, unmarked dirt path until I found a clearing big enough to set up my tent. The trees were thick, their trunks standing like silent sentinels, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves. I set up camp quickly. Tent staked down, sleeping bag unrolled, firewood gathered. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees, so I wasted no time getting a fire going. It was peaceful in a way that made the back of my mind itch. Too quiet, maybe. I pushed that thought away and focused on the warmth of the flames, the crackling of burning wood, the way the light flickered against the trees. The first sign that something was off came when I noticed the woods weren't just quiet. They were dead silent. No birds, no distant hoot of an owl, not even the usual scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my own breathing and the fire. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes. I ate a simple meal, sat by the fire for a while, and eventually crawled into my tent. The forest remained unervingly still. Lying in my sleeping bag, I listened, waiting for the usual night sounds to return. They didn't. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to a noise, a sharp, deliberate snap of a twig. Close. My eyes opened, but I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. The fire had died down to embers, casting only the faintest glow outside the tent. Another snap, closer this time. I forced myself to breathe slowly, carefully, straining to hear past the blood rushing in my ears. There it was, the unmistakable sound of something moving. Not the wind, not some small critter. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly but not turning it on yet. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. A long, horrible silence stretched out. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then something brushed against the fabric. A single, slow drag of fingers or something against the nylon. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight even tighter. My truck was only about 20 feet away. If I could make a run for it. But what if it was between me and the truck? I stayed still. I don't know how long. Minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, the sound of movement started again, but it was different this time. Instead of retreating back into the woods, it circled my tent. Slow, methodical steps, crushing leaves with an unnatural patience. I could hear breathing, low, measured, not an animal. My body screamed at me to do something, but I stayed frozen. I listened as it moved to the other side of the tent, then stopped. Then nothing. Silence again. Minutes passed. An hour. I don't know. But I stayed awake, my muscles locked with fear. I told myself I'd wait until the first sign of daylight before moving. I wasn't going to risk stepping out into the dark, not when I didn't know what was out there. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyes closed against my will. I woke up to sunlight filtering through the tent fabric. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe it had all been a dream. Then I stepped outside. Footprints. They circled my tent, clear as day in the damp earth. Not boot prints, not animal tracks, bare feet, human. I felt a cold sweat break out over my skin. I scanned the trees, every shadow, every branch, every possible place someone could be watching from. But the woods were still, the way they had been last night. I packed up fast, threw my gear into the truck without caring about organization. I wanted out, needed out. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I noticed something in the dirt near the back of my truck. Another footprint, this one facing the driver's side door, like someone had been standing there watching me sleep. I drove faster than I should have down the narrow dirt road, my tires kicking up dust and leaves. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, until the trees were behind me, until the world felt normal again. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't think I want to know. But I do know this. I'll never camp alone again. The drive out to the woods took longer than expected. The road twisted through miles of thick trees, barely wide enough for my truck. The further I went, the more I felt the world behind me disappear. No more houses, no more gas stations, just trees pressing in from both sides, their branches reaching over the road like fingers. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. I liked it that way. I came out here to be alone. No work emails, no texts, no people, just the quiet of the forest. I found the spot I had marked on the map weeks ago. A small clearing, not too close to the river but near enough to hear the water. The air smelled damp and clean. I got out of the truck, stretched, and looked around. Just trees, rocks, and dirt. No sign of any other campers. Perfect. Setting up camp took an hour. The tent went up easily, the firewood stacked nearby. I kept my gear organized, knife on my belt, flashlight in my pocket, bear spray within reach. The sun was already dipping behind the trees. The silence was thick, pressing against my ears. I liked the quiet, but something about it felt too quiet. Not even birds. Maybe it was just the time of day. I made a quick dinner over the fire and sat back in my camp chair, staring at the flames. The sound of the river was steady, a low rush of water over rocks. A breeze moved through the trees, making the branches creak. The fire crackled. It should have been peaceful, but there was something else. A feeling deep in my stomach, like I wasn't alone, like I had forgotten something important. I tried to shake it off. I was just jumpy. It happened sometimes when I camped alone. The human brain wasn't built for this much isolation. I had read about it before, how the mind played tricks when there was too much quiet. I forced myself to relax, let the fire warm my hands. It was fine. Everything was fine. Then I heard it. A sound from the trees. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. It stopped, then started again. slow, uneven. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. Nothing, just darkness between the trunks. The sound had stopped. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon dragging something. I turned back to the fire, but the uneasy feeling stuck to me. The hairs on my arms were standing up. My instincts screamed at me. Something wasn't right. I decided to turn in early. I banked the fire, zipped up my tent, and lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan. I forced my breathing to slow. It was fine. It was just the woods. Then, in the dead of night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it again. That dragging sound. Closer this time, just outside the tent. My heart slammed against my ribs. I reached for my knife, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Silence stretched long and thin. I waited. Then, something pressed against the tent wall. Not hard, just a light, deliberate push, like a hand feeling its way along the fabric. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My fingers tightened around the knife handle. The pressure moved, gliding along the tent wall. Then it stopped. I swallowed. My mouth was dry. I wanted to turn on the flashlight, but I was afraid. Afraid of what I might see if I did. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I fell into a light, uneasy sleep. Morning came pale and cold. I forced myself out of the tent, gripping my knife. The ground around my camp was disturbed. Dirt and leaves had been dragged, forming strange patterns. No footprints, just marks like something had been pulled along the ground. I checked the tree line. Nothing. I checked my gear. Nothing missing. No signs of animals. I told myself it had to be the wind, or my imagination. I should have left then, but I didn't. The day passed in uneasy quiet. I forced myself to eat to go about normal camp tasks. By late afternoon, I convinced myself I had overreacted. I even felt a little silly, just nerves, too much time alone. That night, I built a bigger fire. I sat close to it, letting the heat soak into me. I felt better, stronger. Fire had a way of making things feel safe. The wind had died down. The woods were still. The river murmured in the distance. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. The dragging sound, closer than before. And this time, it didn't stop. It moved steadily toward my tent. Slow, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and my knife. My hand shook as I flicked the light on and pointed it toward the noise. Nothing. Then I noticed something. The bushes near my tent had been disturbed. The leaves were flattened. The dirt shifted. Something had been there. I didn't wait any longer. I packed up my gear in record time, shoving everything into the truck. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. The forest felt like it was closing in. I started the engine and threw the truck into reverse, tearing out of the campsite. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, not stopping until I pulled into my driveway. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I told myself I had overreacted, that it had been nothing, just the wind, just animals. Then, the next morning, I checked the back of my truck. The tailgate was scratched, deep, uneven marks, like something with rough, sharp edges had scraped against it. I never went back to that campsite. I don't know why I felt uneasy about the trip. I usually looked forward to camping, and this time was no different, at least at first. It was a solo trip, something I'd done plenty of times before. There was something about the quiet, the lack of people, the pure stillness of the woods that I found comforting. I planned to spend 4 nights at a remote site deep in the national forest, a place I had never been to but had read about in a few outdoor forums. Secluded, peaceful, untouched, exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck at the nearest trailhead and spent the next few hours hiking in. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through thick trees that blocked out most of the sun. It wasn't until late afternoon that I arrived at my chosen spot, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. It was perfect. I set up camp quickly, getting my tent and gear in place before dark. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the wind in the leaves and the occasional rustling of small animals. As night settled in, I sat by my fire, eating a quick meal and letting the warmth sink into my bones. I felt calm. The unease from earlier had faded, replaced with the usual sense of contentment I felt when I was alone in the woods. That changed around midnight. I woke up to a sound. Not an animal sound, those I could recognize. This was something different. A snap of a branch, followed by what I swore was the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. My body tensed. I listened, barely breathing, waiting for more. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, and the tent felt too thin, too open. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The forest looked the same, quiet, still. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing unusual. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep. The next day, I spent time exploring, hiking along the creek, and checking out the landscape. The uneasy feeling lingered, but I ignored it. There was no reason to be scared. I was alone. I reminded myself of that over and over. That night, I was more alert. The fire was bigger, and I kept my flashlight within reach. I forced myself to stay awake longer, listening to the night sounds, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the footsteps. Then, just past 1 a.m, I heard it again. A branch snapping, then another. But this time it wasn't random. The sounds were coming closer, slow, careful. I stayed completely still, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. The fire cast shadows along the trees, making it hard to tell if something was out there or if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I smelled it. A sharp, rotten stench, like something had been left to decay in the sun for days. It was strong, overwhelming. My stomach twisted, and I swallowed hard, trying not to gag. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam over the trees. Still nothing. I told myself to calm down, to think rationally. Maybe an animal had died nearby. Maybe the wind had carried the scent to my camp. But I knew better. I had been in the woods enough to know the difference. The smell was close, too close. I barely slept that night. I lay in my tent, gripping my knife, waiting for something, anything to happen. But it didn't. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, and with it, the fear faded just a little. I decided to leave early. The trip was supposed to last 4 nights, but I had no interest in staying any longer. Something felt wrong here. I packed up quickly, shoving my gear into my pack and dousing the fire. As I turned to leave, I noticed something. Just beyond the edge of my camp, where the trees grew thicker, the brush was disturbed. The ground, previously untouched, had fresh marks, like something had been standing there for a long time, pressing into the dirt. And there were footprints, not boot prints, not animal tracks, bare feet, large, wide, human. I stared at them, my mind trying to make sense of it. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. The trail was barely used, and I had seen no signs of other campers. A chill crawled up my spine. I needed to go. Now, I shouldered my pack and started walking, moving quickly but trying not to run. The entire time I felt watched. The feeling didn't go away, even as I reached my truck. Even as I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel too tight, my breath too fast. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in civilization, back where the trees didn't loom so close. I don't know who was out there watching me. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this. I won't be going back.